Hi there again, thanks for joining me. To continue our international theme during the Olympic fortnight or the Olympic 17 days, here's a game I just played actually on Lichess against a very strong rated opponent from Egypt. And he has the white pieces, and let's see how the game goes. So my opponent starts with knight f3, which to some extent means I don't know what type of opening he's going to play. So I stick to my Dutch defence, which I like playing, pushing that dark squared pawn forward a couple of squares. And my opponent just continues with his plan. And we both develop quite well. Although to some extent I think my opponent's development is a little passive. There's nothing wrong with it, but having the pawn on d3 rather than d4 does mean that I can occupy the centre, and I already have some space and good development. And also, I have experience in playing the Dutch defence, so I know how these sort of games tend to go. Anyway, my opponent continues by developing a knight, and I play bishop e7 because I want to get my king castled as soon as possible. Okay, now my playing e4. In the Dutch, you generally never want to capture on e4. Well, say never. You never say never, but the exchange on e4. Let's see if I can manage to draw an arrow. I'm not guaranteeing that I can. Yeah, so if I take here, it does give up some of the tension in the position. So I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to continue with my own development. Okay, now I was quite surprised when my opponent played this move, b3. Obviously, he has the intention of moving his bishop onto this square, and that isn't such a bad thing because it will be attacking my king if I castle on the king's side, because his bishop then will have this long diagonal straight down to my king position. However, it does take away from the f4 square, and if I can push a pawn to f4 when the bishop can't control that square, it could be interesting. So I'm just going to continue with castling, and my opponent, as we thought, plays his bishop here. And now, because the bishop isn't on the diagonal that it was, I don't want to get too carried away with the arrows, but I'm in an arrowing mood. I feel a bit like Robin Hood today. So the bishop was on this diagonal, but because it isn't now, I can play f4. And if his king castles to the king's side, I've got a chance of opening up around the king. My opponent does castle, which is sensible, and I'm just going to move my bishop out now. I've only got one minor piece. The minor pieces are the bishops and the knights. So I have one minor piece to develop. So this is a good square because it pins the knight. If the knight on f3 moves, the queen's behind it, and I take the queen. Now c3, I was a bit surprised by this move. The intention of c3 is that I'm trying to this highlighted square, the d4 square, the c3 pawn attacks that square, so my opponent can now push his d pawn. However, pushing the pawn in front of his bishop blocks the bishop, and it just seems quite slow. So I'm moving my queen here for two reasons. One is I want to connect my rooks, so my rooks can now swing across the back rank. And also I'm thinking of playing bishop to h3. Now the reason I'm thinking of playing that is when your opponent fianchettos. Now fianchetto is when you have the structure of the pawns in this triangle. So because my opponent's pawns are all on dark squares, it means that his light squares are potentially weak. So I want to remove his light squared bishop. So that's the reason behind queen d7. So my opponent has moved his queen, which the main reason is his knight is no longer pinned. So now I can continue with my secondary plan of trying to exchange the light squared bishops. And in fact, my opponent can't really stop me, because the only way of keeping his light squared bishop would be to drop back to h1, but then I can take the rook on f1. Okay, so now we see that the move c3 has enabled my opponent to play d4, but I'm just going to continue with the plan that I had of getting rid of the light squared bishops, and now I'm going to start trying to open up some squares on the king side. So I'm going to exchange on this square, and my opponent can take back with either pawn. If he does take back with the f pawn, I have got some threats of, I'm going to try and do a very crooked arrow now, because it's a knight. My knight can move to here and then to here if the f pawn wasn't there, which would be attacking just about everything. So in fact, my opponent's taken back with the h pawn, which is the best move, but I'm still going to play my knight to that same square, but it can't be easily challenged there, and it opens up my rook on the f file. Okay, so my opponent now has to think of what he's going to do. He can push his pawn to d5, attacking my knight, but that would block the position, and it would make it much more difficult for him to attack me, especially with his bishop on b2 out of the game for the moment. And my knight could easily reroute via the d8 and f7 squares. Okay, so this is a fairly good move. The rook is no good in the corner anyway, so he's put the rook opposite my queen. So there may be, if there was exchanges on e5 at some time, for example, if it was white to play, if white was to capture the pawn here, I'd be very careful about taking back with my d pawn, because then a move of the white knight would uncover an attack on my queen. So I'm going to ignore the tension in the middle for the time being and get my rook in the corner into the game. So I'm centralizing my rook, and my opponent is, he just needs to find a plan, to be honest. My plan is to do something on the king side, not sure exactly what. Okay, so this is a good idea. This knight now adds additional pressure onto the e5 square, and I still have possible problems of my queen being attacked by the rook on d1. So the obvious move is to move my bishop to f6, which reinforces the e5 square again. And if my opponent doesn't do anything, I can play my pawn to b5, which would make his knight move again. Okay, so as I was saying, the move I mustn't play here, I mustn't recapture with my pawn, because then my queen would be taken by the rook. So as long as I don't do that at any stage, I should be okay. So I want to attack my opponent's king, so I'm going to recapture with the knight furthest away from his king. And my opponent does the same. And now I'm going to capture, again, I could capture with the knight, I could capture with the bishop, I can even capture with the rook, even though I give up the exchange. But I'm going to capture with the bishop here, because my knight on g4 I think is quite threatening. And now if my opponent does capture, I've got a perfectly good position. If we had knight takes e5, I recapture. Again, I can recapture with the rook or with the knight, but I believe that my king is safer than my opponent's king. Okay, but when my opponent played this, it was very unexpected. Now, the reasoning behind it, I think, is if we look at the rook attacking the h7 square, and if we imagine the pawn on e4 wasn't there, the queen is also attacking this square. So there is potential at some stage for my opponent to get an attack. For example, if it was white to play, white could capture my bishop with a knight, and then perhaps play f4 and e5, which would open up the board. However, it is my move, and this is where I managed to see a very strong continuation. So actually, my opponent's last move was a quite a big mistake, even though it looked very aggressive. So I've just got rook takes knight here, and it sort of blows my opponent's defense to pieces. White has to recapture the rook with the king, otherwise I'm just a piece up for no compensation at all. And this is the point that my rook on e8 can now occupy the f-file, and the pawn on f2 is going to be the weak point now for my opponent, and I think already his position is lost. But let's see how the game continued. Now, again, my opponent can't go to e3 because the knight stops it, and he can go to e2 or to g2. And in fact, they come to very much the same thing, although going to e2 is probably even worse. So my opponent played the best move, although his position is now, I'm pretty certain, losing. So I can take the pawn, which is check. I'm attacking the queen, and my rook is protected by the knight on g4. So white doesn't really have an option other than to give up his queen for the knight and the rook. Now, if we look at the material is fairly even. We both have a dark squared bishop. I have a queen, which in old-fashioned, when you learn to play chess, you say the queen is 9 points, and the rooks are 5 points each. So my opponent, if you like, has 10 points to my 9, and I have one extra pawn. So if we were doing the counting that juniors like to do, and it's not such a bad thing anyway, then their position is even on points. But if we look at my opponent's king, it's so in the open that my next few moves, in fact, the best move here, which I didn't play, is queen to g4, which attacks the pawn on g3 and e4. Now, I'd seen a way of attacking the pawns, but I did it in a not quite so efficient way. So I played queen here, and then the king drops back, and then I played queen to g6, and now I'm attacking my next move. My queen can capture this pawn because it's also defended by the bishop, and my queen can also capture this pawn, and white cannot defend both pawns. Obviously, the most important pawn is the one in front of the king because it gives some sort of defense. So my opponent plays rook here, but I captured the other pawn, and now the game is pretty much over. Wherever my opponent plays, I've got a nasty threat. For example, if my opponent was to play his king to f1 here, I can just play queen to f3, which attacks the rook on d1. My opponent would have to play his king to e1, and then I can take with my bishop the pawn on g3, and I'll be totally winning. But in fact, my opponent played king f2, which allows me just to move my queen here, which is check. After the king moves, I win the bishop, and now I've got a queen and a bishop against the two rooks, and I've got extra pawns, and my king is safe. So my opponent resigned, but it was an exciting game. And you notice that I've toned the shirt down. That's because the weather isn't so good now. But that brings me on to the next point, that I'm thinking of entering the World Weather Forecasting Chess Championship. It's a new thing. You just have to forecast the weather correctly, win a chess game, and that's all there is to it. And in fact, I am the reigning champion. And leaving you on that rather bad joke. See you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.